YouTube, and thanks for joining us on a Sunday morning. I am shooting this video by myself today because it's Sunday and obviously I'm not in school. But I wanted to show you something that I think you'll find pretty interesting. Have a local fabrication shop that has a customer who is getting some rear differential upgrades, putting more power in the car and wants to use a bigger axle. And while we're at it, we are going to narrow the housing and get the wheels and tires tucked up underneath the car the way he'd like. The problem is he wind up acquiring a bunch of parts, and we're kind of in the process of trying to make sense of all of them and making them work. Most speed shops, fabrication shops, chassis builders don't have an issue with customers supplying their own parts. I never minded someone trying to save a couple of bucks. I've done it through the years. I'm sure most of you guys have too. But sometimes it could be a little bit of work trying to make these parts come together as an assembly. So I'm going to give you a little example of just that. Glenn Fernandez called me up and he said, hey, I got a rear end housing, 8.8 out of a Mustang. I need narrowed. Customer has a spool, customer has the axles, but they are either an inch shorter or stock length as a stock Mustang. So it takes me a little bit of time to process it. I'm more of a, yeah, whatever, get it down to me. And then when I lay it all out, I start figuring stuff out. So what I did was I laid everything out on the bench. I pressed the bearings and the retaining ring onto the axle where it belongs, along with obviously the caliper retaining bracket. I then bolted the housing end that we're going to use on, seated it, bolted this together like such, okay? Then what I did was I figured out the engagement for the splines into the spool on both sides to figure out how much leeway we have with how wide we could make the rear end housing. The issue is I was coming up with a variance of about 1 inch to 1.25 inches of where we could make the width of this rear end housing and still have proper engagement into the splines of the spool. The issue with that is that could be a pretty big variance for trying to get the tire tucked up underneath the car the way people would want it. So what I did was I called up Glenn and I said, Glenn, do you have the car? And he said, yeah, I have it. I said, do me a favor and let's get the car at ride height. The wheels and tires that you're going to use for the car, let's get them underneath it, exactly where you want it. Let's call the customer up and say, hey, yep, those perfect, I love it. And then measure from the inside of the wheel to the inside of the wheel where the axle flange face is going to touch. And then we could do the math backwards from there and make sure we get it right where we want it. So he did that, and it turns out the measurement that he came up with fell right in the range of the acceptable spline engagement for the spool. So it turned out to be perfect. The number was 58 inches from inside a wheel to inside a wheel. The rotors are an 1/8 inch thick apiece. So that makes us 57 3/4. And putting the splines in the spool, measuring the depth, making sure we have 100% engagement, fell right in that 57 3/4. So not an issue. It turned out to work out good. So what I'm going to do is I spared you the details of measuring the stock housing. It's not stock, it's highly modified, but it started out as a stock housing. Cutting, measuring, cutting. Everyone's seen a bandsaw cut metal before, not a big deal, right? But what I do want to show you is the importance of welding the ends on square and parallel to the spool bearings using a narrowing fixture. how important that could be and how easy it could be to take that for granted if you don't have one. So that's one of the reasons why I'm here on a Sunday morning. Shop is nice and quiet. We could shoot this video, and I think the content will be pretty cool. So stay tuned and check it out. Okay, guys, before we start welding the housing ends onto the rear, I want to show you how I came up with the math of proper engagement for the splines from the axles into the spool. So someone smarter than me could probably answer why, but in the spool itself, on the, we'll call it the passenger side, the splines start right at the end of the spool. On the driver's side, they're offset in. The total distance of the splines are 2¼ inches from start to finish and from start to finish. But they are offset for some reason, no clue why. The splines on the axles themselves are 3 inches. So what I wanted to make sure was that from this part of the spline, you had as much engagement as possible into the spool. So the splines, we know from this point right here out to the end of the axle is 3 inches. And we know the splines in the spool stop right here. So as you could see, the axle does come a little bit past where the splines end in the spool, which means we have 100% engagement, okay? On this side too, it's gonna be a little hard to see, but same deal. It looks like the axle is gonna wind up right about here, and it's fully engaged into the splines of the spool. I'm not sure what the proper percentage is, if you're allowed to have 75% engagement. I could tell you that you can't beat 100%. So that's what I always try and shoot for when I can. And now I'm just going to show you that when everything is set up the way I want it to be, the ends bolted in place with the retaining brackets, everything in place, I just take my tape measure and I go from axle flat to axle flat, and we are right on the money where we need to be. So that's how I came up with the numbers, and then I could work in reverse. I measure from the new housing end to new housing end now that we know everything is in width where it needs to be, and from that point, I know how to scribe and cut the existing housing, and then everything should fall into place as long as I know math and how to measure and cut. So off to the rear end housing we go. Okay, so now we got the ends cut off the housing at the proper distance. We have the ends prepped. We have them radiused, 45'd, ran a file through the inside and deburred them. And we're ready to set up our narrowing fixture into the jig. Now, again, guys, I'm doing this by myself. If you saw my camera contraption, you'd cringe. But I'll probably be setting some stuff up, little time lapse in between, just so that you don't fall asleep from boredom. But this is part of my narrowing fixture. What this is it's the same OD as the carrier bearing race, okay? And it fits into the housing, snug, with the cap. Goes that way. Always make sure you mark your caps both direction and side. Okay, same thing on this side here. And then, before you completely tighten it up, I like to slide the bar through, and this is a heavy piece. And it's taller than me, which isn't saying much. Slide this right in here gently. Okay, one of the things that's pretty important, guys, is we're dealing with something pretty precise. All right, it's important that we get these bearings riding perfectly parallel with these. If you're going through all the effort of doing all this, take the one last step and use a torque wrench, okay? Figure out what the proper torque is supposed to be, look it up, do whatever you got to do, and torque them. There's no use in doing all of this and then skipping one step that could be potentially pretty important. So, something that I want to show you guys that I think you'll find pretty neat, and I haven't even put this in here yet, so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I guarantee you, just from all the welding that I see that was previously on this housing, that when I put the new housing in with the fixture in, it's not going to line up perfectly with the tube. Let me go grab an end and we'll see if I'm right. And it's off a ton, kind of like I thought. Let me get the camera over here and we'll show you what we got. So, you could see what we have for a distance here, and you could see how as it comes around it grows. That is because this axle tube is actually bent, okay? What probably happened was when all these brackets were welded on, it pulled the axle tube in this direction. And that's one of the things that happens when you don't take enough time in between welds. You get one area too hot. You don't weld up the housing on a fixture table to stop it from bending. But if I'm being completely honest with you, this is something that happens all the time. It means virtually nothing. I've seen them way, way worse than this. At the end of the day, if you could weld this housing end on and it won't leak and it could still run perfectly parallel with the carrier bearing, you really have nothing to worry about. So that's going to be next for us. We see how far off it is. The only issue with doing this is it's hard to make a really pretty weld. The weld will still look good, but the problem is it'll look a lot more buried and you'll have a lot more metal showing over here, where when you wrap around here, it'll tend to look a little bit more flush and like it belongs there. Structurally, not an issue. It'll look good. It'll work good. Customer will have nothing to worry about. And we're going to start tacking this and welding it home, and I'll show you the finished product. All right, we're all ready to throw a couple of tacks in. And then we'll make sure that the fixture still slides around, lets us know that everything's not all bound up. Slides in nice and easy. And the other thing that I forgot to tell you guys too is once you get the bar torqued, main caps torqued into the housing, make sure the bar turns. That'll let you know that everything good is going on in here, that the line hone is nice and straight, you don't have any twists going on in here. It also lets you know that your fixture's set up the way it should be also. So we have that in here, that slides right in. We're gonna rinse and repeat on the other side once I get this all welded up, and you're gonna have a narrowed rear end ready to be assembled and go out the door. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna let this cool. Then I will set the fixture back up. I will rinse and repeat. Put this end, not this end obviously, the end just like it over there. Square it all up in the fixture, tack it, make sure it still slides in and out of the fixture, and then weld it home like I did this side, and we'll have one narrowed rear end housing all ready to be put back together. So that'll do it for narrowing up our 8.8 for our Mustang. The reason why I did this video is because I really wanted to show people what went into actually narrowing a rear differential housing. It's definitely not a 15-minute job, as you could tell even with time lapse. It takes some expensive equipment, it takes some pretty good math, and it takes a lot of time and double checking your work. So the next time you drop off a housing at a chassis shop or fabrication shop to get narrowed, you know what you're paying for. Do me a favor and like, share, and subscribe. And leave some comments. Let me know if you'd like to see a build video on finishing up, setting up the ring and pinion, installing the axles, and getting it ready to go in the car. Until the next time, thanks for tuning in. We'll see you soon.